Hey, what's up, legends? This is Chronos, and we're diving into part 5 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk? Things are heating up, and trust me, you don't want to miss this. Huge shout out to Big Teddy G3498 for continuing to blow us away with this amazing collab. And of course, a big thank you to you, my awesome legends, for your ongoing support. You guys are the real heroes of this channel. Let's jump right into it and see where Deku's energy-absorbing journey takes him next. Chapter 29, Competition. Class 1A got off the bus in front of the large building with many other students from other schools doing the same. They grouped up as Izuku watched everyone else from the other schools to gauge their capabilities. It was somewhat difficult, but quirks affected the person's personality frequently enough to use it as a way to guess their quirks. Granted, it's not perfect, but it's a good way to get started on his possible opponents. One thing he noticed from just about every school was that they all eyed UA more than the others. People watching? Toru came up to his side. Something like that. He murmured, "Ah, you're trying to tear them apart." Toru realized. Izuku looked over at her and gave her a warm smile. She beamed back. "Am I right or am I right?" Izuku chuckled and nodded. "I was trying to guess their quirks and see where they stood. Since they don't have something similar like the sports festival, it's hard to tell." He trailed off and hummed. "What?" Toru poked at his cheek. He swatted her hand away with a smile. He motioned her to follow and went to Yairuzo. "They know our quirks and some of our abilities." He nodded to the other schools. What do you mean?" Yairuzo was thrown off by the usually standoffish boy suddenly talking to her and initiating a dialogue. "What would you do if your possible opponent's quirks were put on live TV for everyone to see?" He posed the question to her. "I would watch, memorize, and develop counters to the ones I could counter." She answered and shook her head in confusion. She looked at where the powerful boy looked and cursed softly in realization. "The sports festival. Wait, everyone knows our quirks? That's bogus." Denki moaned. The rest of the class heard the conversation and also complained about it. Aizawa sauntered up and heard them. "Good. You all realized what it means to be put in the public eye. It would have been nice to know ahead of time." Mina crossed her arms at him. "You all will have to learn on your own." "Yeah. Too bad we don't go to school to learn these kinds of stuff," Izuku said sarcastically. Aizawa shot a glare at the boy but was cut off from shooting back by a voice he didn't want to hear. "Yo, Eraserhead, let's get married." A foam green-haired hero threw her arm around the tired man. "Didn't your profile on him say that he was already married?" Mina asked Izuku. Both heroes' attention was snapped to what the pink girl said. Aizawa's eyes turned to the green-haired boy. "Profile?" he questioned. "You're not special. I have one on everyone." Izuku shrugged and turned to the large mass of thermal energy walking up to them. "You're an odd one, aren't you?" Miss Joke tried to lighten the tense mood between the student and the teacher. She, of course, knew of the winner of the sports festival and his overwhelming power and his humiliation of the second-place winner. "I came to introduce my class from Ketsubutsu Academy." "Hello. Nice to meet you all. I'm Yoshindo." He reached for a handshake and Izuku stared at it. He took the hand and shook it. "Midoriya," he said simply. "I'm sure you already knew that. Self-centered one, huh?" Miss Joke elbowed Eraserhead, but he was watching the interaction carefully, which caused her some trepidation. "He's not, dangerous, is he?" "Very," Aizawa responded and left it at that. "What do you mean?" Yoshindo asked quizzically. "Everyone here watched the sports festival, and anyone worth their weight would have analyzed every frame for our quirks to have an edge on us," Izuku said. "At least, that's what I would have done." He shrugged. "Making friends, are we?" Denki and Hanta sauntered up next to Izuku. "No, just gauging our competitors," Izuku said and turned away. "Makes sense." Hanta nodded and turned with Izuku without waiting. Denki shot finger guns and winked at the blonde girl next to Yo and walked backward for a few steps before tripping and quickly righting himself. Yoshindo's face fell as they walked away, and he also turned away from Yue. He's someone to keep an eye out for. Everyone went to change into their hero suits after the interaction between Izuku and Ketsubutsu Academy. They all grouped up again and headed to the large gathering room filled with over 1,000 other students hoping to get their provisional licenses. A man walked onto the stage and to the podium for the hero commission. He sounded even more tired than Aizawa, if that was even possible. He explained the rules of the exam and how many would be allowed to pass. There was an uproar at the limited slots, but that didn't discourage Izuku or his gang of friends. After putting on the targets on their bodies, every school split off to their desired terrain. Todoroki split off immediately became of his quirk effectiveness with friendly fire. Izuku wanted to do the same, but his gang of friends stopped him from running off. Bakugo also looked like he wanted to go off on his own, but Kirishima held him back from leaving the group. Ever since Bakugo had returned from his capture from the League of Villains, he had been quiet and distant while Kirishima tried to bring him back to how things used to be before everyone had learned what Bakugo had done. Bakugo had asked Kirishima directly one day about the strange behavior of everyone, and the redhead explained what Izuku had told them. Kirishima had tried to play it off like it was no big deal, but Bakugo's silence was enough for Kirishima to figure out it was just as bad as Izuku had said. Ever since Kirishima had tried to get Bakugo to be more friendly, but it only has gone so far. "What's the plan, boss?" Hanta asked in his gruff voice reserved for Izuku. Izuku looked around at the rocky field. "We're going to get jumped as soon as this starts. The best thing to do is jump them back in return." "All right, that sounds good. Who does what? Or are we on the chaos train today?" Mina asked. "It's going to be hard to predict what will be thrown at us with so many variables. I say just stay together and work together as best we can." Izuku shrugged. "Solid enough for me." Denki nodded. The buzzer went off and immediately a rush of students began to throw balls and their quirks at UA. Izuku and Toru flashed them with a bright light that blinded many of them as Hanta began to tie some of them up and reel them in for a tag out. Denki and Mina shot their quirks out to slow the tide of projectiles. Kyuka had her earlobes plugged into the ground for scouting and heard a voice. "Izuku, it's that one guy you were talking to earlier." Kyuka shouted out a warning. Izuku leapt forward and burned many balls into nothing as he caught the smirk shot in his direction by Shindo as he slammed his hands down on the ground. Izuku sensed the massive kinetic energy surging everywhere, and Izuku smirked back behind his mask. He absorbed it all, and the smile on Shindo's face fell and confusion replaced it. He looked to Izuku and he shook his head and slowly placed one hand on the earth. The ground shattered and the whole arena shook at the impact of Izuku's display. The earth erupted beneath everyone's feet and they were thrown off balance. What Shindo tried to do was a pale imitation of what Izuku showed. "Uno reverse, bitch." Denki cackled. Izuku had his target and dashed forward to Shindo, who was just now recovering. He was shocked at the power the student of UA had displayed. He looked up to see the green eyes of the said student staring at him from above. He tried to get up and attack, but a wave of electricity washed over in every direction, stunning them and rendering them immobile. Shindo tried to use his quirk, but it was made useless by Izuku's presence. Any vibrations were nullified and the targets on his body were tagged, and he was out. A few more battles ensued between those who remained on their feet and Izuku's class. A few tried to take Izuku down with their quirks or combat skills, but between absorbing every strike and him being able to immolate anything that tried to capture him, it was no use. A girl with ice armor charged at him with a war cry, but the ice on her body melted away under an aura of intense heat and then batted away with a kinetic blast. Two others tried to trap him by telekinesis and get him off the ground, but a void domain cut their line of sight of their quirks and they were disoriented by the sudden attack, losing their concentration. Two lightning bolts took them down and Izuku moved forward. The rest of Izuku's gang fared well with their teamwork. Hanta was ideal for capturing others and Denki to stun them. The girls acted in supporting roles by defending themselves from others trying to get close by using mists of acid, beams of light, and sound waves. Soon they all passed and were on their way to the next phase. Toru and the other four walked into the waiting area to see Izuku already seated and waited for them. "You left us." Toru pointed an accusatory finger his way. "No, I didn't. I helped break the ambush and just got here before you guys," he explained. "Plus, you all can handle yourselves. Hear that? The boss thinks we are capable." Hanta said smugly, "That's fair." Denki shrugged and went to the snack table with Mina on his heels. Toru plopped next to him and leaned on his shoulder until he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "What do you think the next phase is?" Kyuka caught a water Denki tossed her and sat across from the two. Izuku hummed in thought. We already did fighting with the addition to trim the numbers down. Now, I'm guessing it has something to do with rescue or helping civilians in some way. Or maybe we all have to work together to perform a raid. I'm not entirely sure. 5 whole schmeckles that it's a rescue thing, Denki said to the group with his arms full of snacks for the table. The fuck is a schmeckel? Make it 10 and you got yourself a deal, Mina and Kyuka said at the same time. After some time, the rest of their class joined everyone else in the waiting room. They mostly stayed in groups, but not all together. The one that was mostly alone was Bakugo with Kirishima nearby him. More and more hero hopefuls joined the rest in the waiting room for a while longer. Izuku people watched to see who would pass to the second phase. A few people caught his eye, but mostly one tall boy with a Shiketsu high school uniform often eyed Todoroki from across the room. Soon the last person to pass walked into the room and the TV in the room turned on. The last slot has been filled and the second phase will start soon. There was an aerial view of the terrain they were just in. Everyone watched as those who didn't pass were collected and removed from the area. The second phase will consist of disaster rescue. Multiple explosions rocked the area and leveling everything into rubble. There were cries of alarm, and then the screen switched to show people in blue t-shirts covering themselves in fake blood. Your objective is to rescue civilians from the aftermath. You owe me 10 schmeckles. Denki pointed with a laugh at Mina. The room's wall opened out and the second phase started. Yairuzo took charge immediately. All right, we need to set up a triage zone immediately for the civilians. Anyone with scouting abilities focuses on finding trapped people. Earjack, Tentacle, Anima, and Flux would be ideal. Everyone else helps with getting them out safely. Who put you in charge? Another test taker asked hotly. Who cares who's in charge? This phase is a team effort. Your name gets written down on the participation trophy like everyone else. Izuku said loudly enough for everyone to hear as he began to look for people under the rubble. Here, got 2. He pointed down. Everyone jumped into action and spread apart. Sato and Mina worked together to melt and toss rubble out of the way to get 2 mostly unharmed civilians to the triage zone. Izuku didn't stick around and kept scanning with his sixth sense to find thermal signatures buried or hidden. He called out multiple times to indicate where people were and sometimes helped others get people to safety. Hello, I'm Flu. Are you hurt anywhere? Izuku knelt by a crying woman whose legs were trapped by rebar and concrete. My leg, it hurts. She could shift it somewhat but couldn't get out. Izuku looked around the leg to see how safe it would be for him to cut her out. All right, I'll get you out in a moment. What's your name? He asked as he heated his hand to the point it was glowing. He absorbed the excess heat radiating to avoid hurting the woman and cut through the rebar like wet paper. Akio, please hurry, she whined. Just a moment, he said calmly. The last bar holding her leg was released and Izuku was able to lift the block to get her out. He saw another test taker looking around and called out, Here, take Akio to the triage zone. The teen ran over and gently picked her up. Before he left, Akio shot Izuku a thumbs up. He felt pride at that and kept going to search for civilians. He ran into his classmates and helped where he could, but his main focus was on finding people inside of getting them to the triage zone or getting them out. Izuku hesitated when there was an explosion in the area. He let out a sigh of relief when the overseer of the exam said it was part of the test and that a villain came back. Izuku debates between helping the civilians and going and fighting. He saw a few go off to fight, including Todoroki, so he chose to stay for a bit longer to help civilians. He heard the battle go on as Izuku pointed out hidden people. Flux, this is Kriati. Help with the villain, we got it here. Izuku heard over his earpiece everyone got at the start of the phase. Izuku looked over to where the sounds of battle quieted down and the erratic flames shooting into the air. He frowned at the display and began to run with bursts of kinetic energy. Once he was clear from hurting anyone, he blasted off with kinetic energy into the air to gain an aerial view of what was happening. He saw Todoroki and that boy that was glaring at him in the waiting room collapse by Gang Orca's Quirk. Once he found his target, he aimed himself at him and rocketed forward. He saw his sidekicks and pulled the rubber ball bearings and shot them at the groups. Many of them went down at the scattered shots. Gang Orca heard the cries of pain and looked behind him to see the plumes of dust from the impacts of the projectiles. He looked up to see where they came from just in time to see a masked boy coming straight at him. He crossed his arms to block and then felt the small touch before being catapulted back at speed. He tumbled in the air until he bounced off the ground to a stop. He groaned in pain at the hard landing and got up to see who hit him. Izuku took off the jacket and tossed it next to Todoroki's prone form. He was aware of Gang Orca's quirk and its effects, so he wasn't worried about the ones that were immobilized by it. He was also aware of his weaknesses and fighting style. Gang Orca met his eyes and Izuku began walking forward to the villain that was attacking. "Surrender," Izuku called out. "You puny hero, you dare?" Gang Orca said, imperialistic tone. "That was a good strike. Too bad that's all you'll manage to get," he said in his normal tone. He screeched, launching a subsonic wave at Izuku to stun him. Izuku kept walking forward and the sound wave was absorbed into his core without an issue. Kogo Sakamata, Quirk, or Sinus. Enhanced strength, speed, and durability with the added ability to launch subsonic attacks to stun opponents. Most effective underwater, even deadly. Weak to heat and dehydrated. You are one of my most liked heroes. Izuku never stopped walking forward as he spoke. That's pretty impressive, but can you back it up? Gang Orca was a bit unnerved at his profile being said out loud by the boy before him. "I can now surrender." The pants Izuku wore burst into flames, leaving him in his black suit underneath. The stone under his feet began to warp and melt. An intense heat washed out from him in every direction. Everyone in the facility felt the temperature rise. Cement blobs shot at Izuku, but they washed over his body in liquid glassy substances. Gang Orca stepped back at the impossible heat, but Izuku didn't stop his advancement. The earth under his feet glowed hot and acted closer to putty than solid ground. Izuku stopped as the suit on Gang Orca began to smolder. "Surrender," Izuku commanded and pointed two fingers with lightning arcing at the tips. Gang Orca began to pant at the heat and tried to pour the water he had on his head, but it evaporated before it could touch his skin. He felt his durable skin begin to burn and his heat-resistant suit began to burn. "I surrender." His voice was rough from being severely dried out. Izuku immediately stopped his release of thermal energy and began to absorb it back quickly. The ground around him solidified and the air cooled drastically. Gang Orca let out a sigh of relief and slumped to his backside. The facility quickly became colder as Izuku kept stretching out to absorb small amounts of thermal energy from the whole area, instead of making it a frozen winter wonderland that spread. "So, I guess I should have gotten something to tie you up with until the police came to get you," Izuku said awkwardly to Gang Orca on the ground. "Not a bad idea to add to your equipment, but I doubt anything would survive your power." Gang Orca chuckled and Izuku nodded at the statement. "That's not all you had stored in you, was it?" Izuku shook his head. "No, only a fraction." He didn't mention how small of a fraction. The speakers announced the end of the exam after they found the last civilian. Izuku gave a wave to Gang Orca and headed off to change and see his results. On his way to pick up his jacket, Todoroki had been able to sit up and the other boy was staring at Izuku like he was a monster. Izuku picked his jacket up and dusted it off before holding his hand out to Todoroki to help him up. He nodded and stood up with his help and then turned to the other boy and did the same Izuku did for him. The other boy looked at the hand and then at Todoroki. He took it with a wary smile and they made their way to the locker room. "Yo, Flux, did you create a miniature sun? It was burning over here." Denki had his jacket off as well and some lingering sweat was on his brow. Toru skipped forward and took Izuku's jacket before putting it on. "It did get really hot. What happened?" He melted the ground and made Gang Orca surrender. The tall boy said in contemplation. "Ah, just like All Might then?" Mina asked. "All Might?" The boy asked. "Nah, I like Gang Orca. The most he got was first-degree burns." Izuku shrugged. "All over his body, most likely," Todoroki muttered. Chapter 30, Internships. Everyone that passed the second phase stood waiting to see their results of the exams. Many were anxious to see their name on the screen saying they passed and would receive a provision license. Toru stood next to Izuku, wringing her hands and had a scrunched-up face in worry. Izuku set his hand on hers to calm her down and smiled reassuring to her. A few moments later, the screen lit up and everyone had their focus on it. There were many cries of joy and some cries of disappointment. Izuku found his name and felt the weight fall off his shoulders. He had passed, and so had everyone in his gang of friends. Toru leapt for joy and threw her arms around Izuku's neck. He caught her and held her tight. Most of his class had also passed except for Todoroki. Bakugo had also passed, but it was by a close margin, 1 point lower, and he would have failed like Todoroki. When everyone had calmed down, they went through the process to get their licenses and then board the bus to head back to the dorms. The atmosphere in the bus was at a high because of the success of everyone. They gave some apologies to Todoroki, but he didn't seem to mind it as much. "I made a mistake during the exam and it caused me to fail. I will do better next time," Todoroki said with conviction. "What happened? It was that tall bald guy, wasn't it?" Mina asked. He nodded. He took the UA recommendation exam but chose Shiketsu High School instead. He said I had the same expression my father had and didn't much like the man either, and he grouped me up with him. He explained. "Your father is an ass." Izuku nodded. Todoroki gave the faintest of smiles. "You only went to my father's agency for energy, didn't you? Used him like a battery, a good battery." He sighed in remembrance. The gang snickered at their leader using the now #1 hero as a fuel source. The rest of the trip back to the dorms was quiet enough. The class had dinner together and relaxed in the common room. Izuku pulled out a book he had been reading and let Toru snuggle under his arm while watching TV like the majority of the class was. Izuku caught the eye of Yaoruzo trying to see what he was reading. He moved the back for her to see and her eyes gleamed. "Midoriya, would you be open for me to borrow that once you are done? I have a collection you might like in return," Yaoruzo asked with hope. Izuku smiled and nodded. "All right, I have a few as well." The class subtly turned their attention back to the TV and rested for the rest of the dimming light. There were croaks from Tsuyu in contentment as she soaked in the thermal energy Izuku emitted for both Toru and himself. She hadn't spoken to Izuku, but everything she had seen of him was good. He was only hard on those he didn't like. Tokoyami was in the same boat as Tsuyu and enjoyed Izuku's company, but the group of friends was too rowdy for his tastes. The rest of the class also began to have an understanding of the powerful boy and his attitude to many things. All except for two, Bakugo and Ida. Ida still had negative feelings toward the green-haired boy for stopping what he had planned, and to a much lesser extent Todoroki. Bakugo had been going to mandatory therapy to fulfill a condition to be allowed to join UA. He had his mindset changed a lot and didn't know what to do with the boy he had tortured for over a decade. Kirishima was reluctant to stay by his side, but stuck with him when he saw Bakugo was trying to change. Kirishima nudged Bakugo to go and the blonde gritted his teeth. He walked over to Izuku. "Can we talk in private?" Everyone's eyes were on him except Izuku's. "No," the green-haired boy said simply. His gang of friends looked back at Bakugo after Izuku's answer. They were very familiar with what kind of relationship the two had, and they didn't like the blonde at all. Kirishima winced at the wall Izuku had thrown up as Bakugo tried to make progress. Bakugo clenched his fists even more tightly and asked again. "It's important, please?" He gritted out. Izuku stopped reading and looked at the red eyes of his tormentor. He stared with cold eyes in return and spoke. "No." He turned back to his book. "I want nothing to do with you. I wanted you out of my life, but you came back and I can't do anything about it yet." Bakugo looked down and his face flushed red. I'm sorry I hurt you for so long. I'm sorry for what I did," he said with his head bowed. Izuku looked up from his book again to glare at the blonde. "You know I will never forgive or forget what you had done. So why are you apologizing?" "Bro, he's quiet." He turned on Kirishima and he shrunk under the intense glare. "I want nothing to do with you." Izuku stood to leave. Bakugo yelled after him. "I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know it was wrong. I wish I never listened to the teacher's words." Izuku stopped and turned back. He gave Bakugo a pitying look. "Do you know who the lawyers that red-taped your file work for?" Bakugo furrowed his brow at the change of subject and shook his head. "What do you think is going to happen when you graduate?" You will be owned by whoever they work for. Going back to step 1 and listening to others telling you it's okay to do what you want. What? What are you talking about? Bakugo growled in confusion. You think they did it out of the kindness of their hearts? No, whoever they are wanted a tool with a powerful quirk under their leash. After all, you owe them everything. He left Bakugo with a pale face and a cold sweat dripping down his neck. Izuku woke up with a weight on his bed that he wasn't expecting. He looked down and saw Toru curled against his chest. He furrowed his brows and looked at the closed and locked door. He was trying to understand how she got inside as Toru stirred awake. She looked up at Izuku's raised brow. Toru giggled and buried her face in his chest. While it's nice to see you, how did you get in? Izuku said, hugging her. Teamwork, she said, muffled. She looked up. I stole your key. Hanta made a tape outline, and Kyo asked for Yaemomo to make a copy for a favor. She beamed. You thief, he said warmly and held her tight. He remembered that they had school soon and groaned softly. She understood and snuggled in as deep as she could in his warmth. Izuku got up and so did Toru. She turned to him and gave him a peck on the lips before heading to her room to get ready. After a rushed breakfast, the whole class shared one large kitchen. Everyone was seated at their desks waiting for Aizawa to show up. A few minutes later, after the bell had rung, he arrived and stood behind the podium. Good, you are all here, he drawled out. On time, unlike some... Izuku muttered, but Kyuka caught it and held in a snort using all her willpower. As you know, the reason for the Provision Hero license most of you have is for you to be able to use your quirks in an emergency to help in a situation. This also gives you the ability to intern with a hero, similar to earlier in the year but more in-depth work. He motioned to the door and 3 upperclassmen men walked in. These 3 are UA's big 3. The strongest and most likely to reach the top ranks when they graduate. They introduced themselves to the class with Tamaki failing and having Mirio do it for him with a chipper attitude. Nijire buzzed around the room asking questions and being curious about everything she sees, like a child. The class was very unconvinced that they were the top-ranking students. Mirio took the doubt in stride and proposed a spar. Most of the class was offended by his disregard for the class. Aizawa shrugged and motioned everyone to head to the gym. Everyone in Class 1A was changed into their gym uniforms and stood together against Mirio across the field from them. Todoroki was to the side, not wanting to participate since he didn't have a license. Physical attacks won't work on him, Izuku said to the whole class as he stared at Mirio, beaming a smile at them. Oh, shit, Mina said excitedly. You've been profiled. She pointed at Mirio, who looked confused. Izuku stepped forward and began. You can sink into solid materials and shoot out of them as if you were being launched. It's not indefinite. My guess is you still have to breathe and you can't see when you use your quirk. Can you? Mirio's smile fell and he looked surprised. You're just like Sir, right? I forgot you are an intern for Sir Night Eye. He was nice when I met him. A fan, huh? He is pretty great. How'd you meet him? Mirio had his smile again. When I sold all my All Might merch to him a year ago. That was you? He was extremely happy, but why? He asked curiously. Because I didn't like to have the face of the man who told me to give up trying to be a hero all over my room, Izuku said coldly. Mirio's smile fell completely away and a look of denial arose. All Might? He would never do such a thing, he said defensively. He didn't think a quirkless kid could become a hero and left me without any other encouragement other than be realistic. He watched Mirio's face crumple. But what does it matter? We're here to fight, so fight me. Izuku shrugged and waited for the first move. Mirio looked between everyone at the information the young man had just let out. From the looks of the green-haired boy's friends, he wasn't lying. His friends gave Mirio sympathetic looks. He turned back and focused on what was before him for the time being. He could ask the number 1 hero who gave him his legacy about it later. All right then, here we go. Mirio charged forward with a cracked smile. Izuku didn't move and let Mirio come to him. Just as he had said, Mirio sunk into the ground and shed his clothes as he did so. In an instant, almost his whole class was down. Kyuka and Toru tried to use their quirks on him, but it had minimal effects. While he didn't like seeing Toru and his friends laying in pain, he knew it was a training exercise. But what caught his attention was the immense speed and strength Mirio had displayed that he had never shown before. Izuku was the last one standing as he stared at his friends moaning on the ground. Denki gave him a thumbs up and he calmed just a bit more. He sensed the thermal signature rise from the ground rapidly in his direction. He finally turned his head to meet eyes with Mirio as his fist was extended and gently placed against his stomach. "You're stronger and faster. Something isn't right." Izuku shook his head and was more sure of himself as Mirio's eyes widened just a hair. Mirio quickly sank back into the ground and struck at his back, but the same thing happened. His fist came to a dead stop and Izuku turned to meet his eyes. The kinetic impact launched Mirio back into the ground and he sunk into it. He arose from a few feet away. "It seems we are at an impasse. You can't hurt me and I can't hurt you," Mirio said with everything from the waist up showing. He heard a bark of laughter from behind Izuku and saw a few snickering. "You're partially right, you can't hurt me." A lightning bolt struck at him and he quickly sunk into the earth. Mirio tried again at striking at his exposed back, but nothing came of it. He felt an immense heat wave and he felt his hand burn. He cried in pain and sucked in a breath. It was a mistake as his lungs burned as well. He sunk into the ground to get away. He felt the ground begin to heat up and got away from the area to a cooler place. Izuku switched between thermal and electric to sense where Mirio had gone, since using his thermal sense was useless as the ground heated up. He watched Mirio rise from the ground on the other side of the gym, gasping in air and coughing harshly. "Do you surrender?" Izuku asked as he asked many others. Mirio smiled at the challenge and sunk back into the ground to attack. Izuku shrugged and released even more thermal energy into the immediate vicinity, causing the ground to melt and the air to boil. His clothes burned away, leaving him in his black Quirk clothes. Mirio was about to rise under Izuku to push him off his feet, but sunk again at coming close to the molten concrete. Mirio rose from a distance and witnessed the globe of pure heat as Izuku stood in the center of it. "I can't do much, huh? I would think this is a tie since you can't catch me," Mirio called out. "Sure, you can call it a tie." The heat disappeared and the molten concrete solidified under Izuku's feet. It was cracked and uneven. "Can we fight?" Nijire called out and flew closer with her quirk. Izuku sensed the new energy and absorbed it from under her feet. She lost her propulsion and crashed into the ground. She sat up in confusion and flew up again. She looked around to see what had happened. She saw Mirio and Tamaki staring behind her, and turned to see Izuku observing the energy her quirk produced. She felt an innate fear of seeing her power in someone else's hands. "What is your quirk? Where does this energy come from?" Izuku asked, not taking his eyes off the glowing spiral in his palm. When she didn't respond, he turned to her. "Nijire, huh? Oh, it's my vitality and my quirk converts it to that," she said softly. Izuku grunted in dissatisfaction. "Then, it's not useful to me." He aimed his palm into the ground and shot a bit of the energy to experiment. It was slow and made a small divot in the ground. "I can't control it either. Definitely unusable for me." "Her quirk isn't useless," Mirio said harshly to Izuku. Izuku turned to him and furrowed his brows. "Of course it isn't. No quirk is truly useless. I said it was useless to me. I can't control the spiral and I would need her as a source. It's unrealistic for me to use this ever in the future. For her, well, she's the top 3, isn't she?" He shook his head. Mirio deflated at the misunderstanding. "Sorry. As for you, something is different from what I have seen during last year's festival and now." Izuku eyed Mirio, shifting uncomfortably. "My quirk evolved." He lied. "That's a lie. If it did, you wouldn't say it like that. Everything you have been was enthusiastic and happy, but tell me your quirk evolved with that tone isn't right." Izuku eyed him. "You are very like him." Mirio chuckled uncomfortably. "Then I can't say," he said with a clenched jaw. Izuku hummed non-committally and turned to greet his friends. He smiled warmly as Denki and Mina reenacted the fight badly. "Why didn't you use your mist?" he asked Mina. She stopped and blushed purple. "I panicked and was too slow." She looked away sheepishly. Tamaki finally got close to the group. With his eyes downcast, he gave a paper to Izuku. "From Fat Gum." he said quietly and turned away. Izuku didn't ask him anything more since he was sure Tamaki would clam up even more than he was at the moment. He opened the slip of paper to see an invitation to his agency as an intern. He closed his eyes and recalled what he had on Fat Gum in his profiles. The man was a good hero with a great attitude, a protective streak, and a quirk that suited his personality very well. He let the invitation go and Toru snatched it to read it. "When should I go?" Izuku asked no one in particular. "Tomorrow after school," Tamaki said quietly and walked away. Izuku was sure he would either have to go find him or Tamaki would be waiting outside his classroom door. He shrugged and made to leave with his friends. Mirio and Nijire stared after him and the scars covering his shoulders and what was revealed on his back. Mirio clenched his singed hand and thought about what he had said about All Might. "I need to go talk to him." Chapter 31. Fat Gum. Izuku hugged Toru goodbye and waved to his friends as he walked out to the front gate. He found Tamaki walking in the same direction and met up with him halfway there. The upperclassmen looked up briefly to make sure it was Izuku and then turned their eyes lower. The Absorber had looked up his profile from the past year and rewatched the third-year sports festival so he could get a grasp of what kind of person Tamaki was. While having a powerful quirk with the ability to use it masterfully, the older boy had borderline crippling anxiety. It was exemplified by the way the third-year's shoulders slouched and his eyes didn't stray far from the ground in front of him. "Would you be more comfortable if I stayed quiet, or can I ask questions?" Tamaki was quiet for such a long moment that Izuku thought he chose the former. "What do you want to know?" he said 5 minutes later. "Why did Fat Gum invite me?" They got closer to the train station. Tamaki looked up again to see what Izuku's face was showing. He took the look of curiosity as a front for Izuku mocking him and looked down again. "He is probably interested in replacing me with you," he said morosely. Izuku's eyebrows shot up at his words and then furrowed. "I doubt that. You are a very capable student and soon be a hero. Even if you have your disadvantages. From what I've seen, you are very good." Tamaki looked away from the perceived taunting. "He just wants someone without my disadvantages," he said even more morosely. "Everyone has disadvantages. No one is perfect. Not even your sunshine child of a friend, and especially not me." Tamaki hummed at that and turned back to see where his steps would land. Izuku guessed that's all the boy had in him for the time being. He stayed quiet for his benefit and followed Tamaki into a train headed to Fat Gum's agency. On the trip, he recalled the information he had on Fat Gum. Everything he had read and researched about the hero said that he was a good man and a good hero. While not ranked too high, he is capable of his job as a hero. He could see the connection between Izuku's quirk and Fat Gum's, as they both could absorb kinetic strikes. Fat Gum used his fat to absorb them and redirect it as a powerful strike at the cost of his body fat. The train stopped and Tamaki began to move out and Izuku followed. It wasn't long before they arrived at a building. The older boy walked in and held the door for Izuku. There was a loud voice that came immediately after Tamaki walked in. "Sun Eater, great to see you again, and you've brought Midoriya." Fat Gum walked up to them with a beaming smile. Tamaki shrunk into himself slightly and Izuku frowned at that. He turned to the extra-large hero. "He thinks you're going to replace him with me." The hero's smile fell and looked at Tamaki. "That isn't true, lad. I would never do such a thing," he said softer and held the older boy by the shoulders to face him. "You are one of a kind." He smiled more fatherly to him. Tamaki looked up at the smiling face of his mentor and faintly smiled as well before looking away with reddened ears. "I'm sure there are others just like me." Fat Gum ruffled his hair roughly. "None of that, you are one of a kind. Saying any different would be a lie." Izuku did what he did to see what kind of man Fat Gum was behind closed doors, and he didn't like how Tamaki kept putting himself down. Izuku could see Tamaki as himself if his determination and conviction weren't as strong as they had been. The hero turned to Izuku and gave him a thankful nod. "Come on, let's sit down for a chat. Hope you're hungry." He led them with a smile. Tamaki walked beside Izuku and said softly, "Thanks." Izuku nodded with a hum. Instead of the office he was expecting, Fat Gum led the two students to a cafeteria. The hero sat down after grabbing a large plate of food in each hand and motioning Izuku do the same. They finished their food and Fat Gum hummed in pleasure. He clapped his hands and leaned forward, looking at Izuku. "So what do you say? Wanna be my intern?" he said with a smile. "Not with more information." Izuku shook his head. "Fair enough. What do you want to know? Why are you inviting me?" he hummed in thought. "Because I've read the report about you during your internship with the Endeavor Agency. During your patrol with Burnin, when that villain tried to use you and a civilian as a hostage with his quirk, what did you do? Pulled the woman away from the crowd and drained the energy from the bomb on her and then me." He snapped his fingers and pointed at him. "Exactly, you ensured both minimizing damage and the safety of the woman. I like that. Also, your quirk fits in well with my theme. He turns into what he eats and you take any blows without stopping." He pointed at the two students. Izuku took that in and nodded. "What do you think of quirkless people?" His smile faded. "They're people like you and me, only missing a tool that most people are born with." He looked a bit sad as he spoke and asked, "Why do you ask?" Izuku watched the man's every feature as he spoke. "I'm a late bloomer. I only got my quirk a year ago. Before that, I was belittled and beaten by almost everyone in my previous school. Teachers docked my grades, police would ignore me, hospitals wouldn't take me, and my peers used their quirks on me. What I'm asking is, what do you think of me?" he said with a flat voice. The man's face saddened even more as he listened and grew angry before the end. "What school did you go to?" he asked, almost standing up. "Aldera." The hero furrowed his brows at the name. "Where have I heard that name before?" His eyes snapped to Izuku again. "That was the school that was raided. Everyone was investigated and all of the staff was sent to the slammer. It was ugly from what I've read. I made sure of it. I gave enough evidence to police and news stations that they didn't have any other options," he said wistfully in remembrance of that wonderful day. "You never answered my question. What do you think of me?" The hero rounded the table and knelt before the seated student. "Whether you have a quirk or not, you're still you. With that mind of yours, you would have been a hero nonetheless." He patted Izuku's shoulder. Izuku's eyes softened and he almost began to tear up. He looked away and cleared his throat. "That's good to hear. At least you weren't alone, right? You had your parents." The hero tried to reassure the boy. Izuku sighed and shook his head. "My mother abandoned me long ago and I've never met my father. I was on my own for dash." That's all he got out as Fat Gum yanked him into a hug. The hero sobbed and fat tears rolled down his face as he squished Izuku into his body. "You went through so much," he practically yelled. Izuku couldn't respond as he was beginning to suffocate with his face pressed against the man's pliable chest. Even as his oxygen ran out, it felt nice to be embraced by the man. When he couldn't hold it anymore, he zapped the man lightly to let him go. He took in a lung full of air immediately after being released. He was grabbed by the shoulders again and made to face the hero. "If you ever need help, I'll gladly do what I can," he said seriously with tear stains on his face. Izuku felt himself relax. He smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Fat Gum. That means a lot." He was the first adult to offer any help and Izuku was grateful. After a bit of time to calm down, Fat Gum spoke again. "Would you like some time to think about my offer?" "No need, I'll join." Izuku smiled at the large man. He threw his hands into the air in celebration. "Wonderful. This means a feast." Tamaki finally moved from his awkward position at the table. He listened to everything Izuku had said and was also saddened by what he said. They had food brought to the table and they ate a bit more. Fat Gum was happy to have a new intern and the feast before him. Fat Gum led Izuku to the office while Tamaki went off to change for the day. The hero signed what he needed for Izuku and handed it off to him. He explained to Izuku what he would most likely be doing while under his care. For the most part, Izuku would tag along with either Sun Eater, Fat Gum, or both. They finished up what they needed and they parted ways until the next day. Izuku made his way back to the dorms with his paperwork. "Izuku, how'd it go?" Toru was the first to greet him as he walked through the dorm's doors. "Pretty good." Izuku smiled back. "Yo." Denki and Kyuka said at the same time as they battled in the game. Mina shuffled to the side to let Izuku sit next to Toru. He took the seat gratefully and let out a sigh of relief. "Everything okay?" Mina asked. Izuku looked confused why she would be asking. Yeah, why? That sigh didn't sound all right, Toru added. That's just a guy thing. I think it starts like that and evolves more and more, Denki said, not looking away from the screen. Sato, who was intently watching the match on the screen, added, Oh, kinda like when Dad gets up with a grunt even though he could bench all of us put together. Careful, Izuku. The leading cause of children is premarital handholding. Then boom, you're a dad making dad noises. Mina teased. There were scattered chuckles in the common room at her words. Izuku was lost in thought as he imagined him being a father. He was brought out of his thoughts by Toru staring at him intently. She quickly looked away with heat on her face, but she didn't let go of his arm. Later in the night, Izuku was at his desk working on his Quirk notebook when he heard a knock at his door. He got up and opened it to see a set of floating clothes. Just as he was going to turn his thermal sense on, Toru slipped under his arm and dove under his bed covers. Izuku's brow creased in both amusement and question. He walked over to his bed and the still person under his covers. He tugged on the covers and Toru held tight and pulled back. Her face peeked out and stuck her tongue out at him. Get your own. Those are my own. Izuku chuckled. Then come and take them from me, she said, covering her head again. Izuku was about to try and tug on the covers again and stopped. Toru, do you want to sleep in the same bed? His face burned slightly at the realization of why she would barge into his room late at night. Do you not want to? She asked with her voice muffled by the blankets. Izuku remembered the first night at the dorms and the sleepover they had. I don't mind, he said softly. The bed covers were opened up by Toru. She was sporting a light blush with a soft smile. Izuku crawled into the bed with her. He shuffled around and settled. Immediately, Toru took one arm and put it around her and she shuffled under his arm. She smiled shyly at him and leaned up to peck his lips. Good night, she said. Izuku had to clear his throat twice before speaking properly. Night, Toru. The next day, Izuku headed back to Fat Gum's agency for his first day. Sun Eater was already there and gave him a nod in greeting. Izuku changed into his hero suit and went to meet up with the hero. Fat Gum greeted the two students happily and showed them their routes for the day. Izuku would tag along with Sun Eater for the day. They made their way out and began the day. Anything I should keep an eye out for that you've noticed in the area? Izuku asked. Sun Eater hummed in thought and shook his head. Just the normal stuff. Also, what's your code name? Flux. He put on his half mask. Sun Eater nodded and they began to walk down the sidewalk. Sun Eater was recognized by some civilians waving at him as he passed by. Izuku introduced himself when they asked and they continued with little trouble. For 2 days, Izuku and Tamaki patrolled the area with small-time criminals popping up randomly. On the third day, the two students joined Fat Gum on his patrol of the city. So what do you think of your future so far? Fat Gum asked around a mouthful of food. It's what I expected and I'm pretty happy with it, Flux said while looking around. That's great to hear. Here, have a bite. Fat Gum tossed a snack into Izuku's hands without taking no for an answer. There was a commotion ahead of them and two gangs were close to coming to blows when they arrived. Many tried to flee when they saw the group of heroes, but Fat Gum blocked them and they were trapped in his body fat. The hero laughed at the ease of the capture, but one of the thugs used his quirk to escape from the hero. He didn't get far as Flux blocked him from escaping by aiming his pointer and middle fingers at him with lightning arcing around them. He skid to a stop and Sun Eater took that opportunity to capture him with his tentacles. Great teamwork, Fat Gum called out from a bit away. Izuku smiled under his mask at the praise and helped Sun Eater to handcuff the thug. Izuku turned when he sensed one person come out of the crowd. He shoved Sun Eater down and the gunshot went off. Izuku absorbed the impact of the bullet and grabbed it before it fell to the ground. He was shocked to see it wasn't a bullet but a small syringe. His eyes locked onto the shocked man's face. Gun! Get down! Fat Gum shouted to everyone. Izuku aimed his hand at the gunman to shoot a lightning bolt at him, but he was in front of the crowd and he could miss. He cursed and blocked another bullet he aimed at Tamaki. The man began to sprint away from them and Izuku caught up to him with bursts of kinetic energy through his feet. He heard the thug say something mocking, but Izuku ignored him in favor of tackling the man and sending a shock through his body. He screamed in pain, but Izuku grabbed his hands to subdue him. A small blade extended from his wrist and slashed Izuku's hands. He cursed and let go with bleeding hands. One weakness of his quirk was that if he was slashed, he could get hurt. Stabbing, on the other hand, he could absorb the impact and move away from the tip of the blade pushing into him. The man laughed and pulled something out of his coat. Flux didn't wait to see what it was and shot him with a bolt of electricity that caused him to convulse and fall limply onto the ground. The syringe he held was crushed in his hand. Fat Gum ran up to his intern and saw the cuts on his hands. "Shit, you okay?" "Flux?" Fat Gum asked. Izuku briefly looked down at his bleeding hands and back at the villain to make sure he didn't move. "Probably need stitches. You got shot too," he pointed out. He moved to handcuff the unconscious villain and noticed the broken glass from the syringe. "What's that?" "Not sure. I didn't think it was a good idea to let him do whatever with that." He saw Sun Eater run up to them and headed for Izuku. He pulled out a small medical kit and helped Izuku slow the bleeding. The absorber took off his jacket and held his arms up to slow the bleeding. Blood dripped down his arms and to the ground. "Thanks, Sun Eater," Izuku said, sitting down on a set of stairs in the alley. "You got shot too, didn't you?" he asked and pulled his eyes away from Izuku's heavily scared shoulders. Izuku remembered the odd bullet and nodded to his jacket. "In a pocket, careful. It's not a bullet." Tamaki searched his jacket slowly and pulled out the syringe bullet that would have hit them both. "Fat Gum." He gave it to the hero after looking it over. "That doesn't look good." The hero grimaced and pulled out a small plastic bottle to put it inside. "Let's get you some help." The hero put it away and helped Izuku to the sound of sirens coming closer. Tamaki took the last villain with them and handed him off to the police. He walked over to the back of the ambulance that helped his underclassmen close the wounds on his hands. The paramedic's quirk sealed the cut little by little until it was gone. A scar was left in its place, and then he moved on to the other hand. "Thanks for stopping the bullets. What kind of upperclassman am I to let you do that?" he said self-deprecatingly. "I could take them without injury. If you took one of them, who knows what that stuff would have done to you, I guess," he said, looking down. "He's right. Some heroes work alone because they can. Others work in teams to cover their faults." Fat Gum patted Sun Eater's shoulder with a smile. "What of the bullet?" Izuku asked, wiping his arms clean of blood. "Handed it off to the police to have it investigated and screened. Never seen anything like that." He shook his head. Chapter 32. Shie Hassaikai. A few days passes as Izuku continued his internship with Fat Gum and Sun Eater. Any day the hero gave Izuku off was spent with Toru and his friends. It was more often to see Izuku with Toru at his side than not. While away, Mina teased Toru for missing her other half. On one particular day off on the weekend, Izuku and Toru went out into the city to enjoy themselves. It was a spontaneous choice by Toru. Izuku barely had any time to get changed before she dragged him out of his room with a couple of things he quickly grabbed. She seemed excited to go, and Izuku couldn't keep his smile off his face as she led him out of the gates. The first stop was at a small shop that sold pastries that caught her attention. He paid for both of them with Toru's protesting at his arm. He managed to put her at ease when he proposed she pay the next time they visited the shop. She agreed grudgingly but still smiled up at him. From there, they went to a small mall to wander around and window shop while talking about school, her parents, his internship, and many more mundane things. When they neared a small park, Toru pulled him to a bench under a tree's shade. "You know that secret move I've been keeping you from seeing?" Toru asked eagerly and somewhat shyly. Izuku smiled softly at her and nodded. "Yeah. Are you finally going to tell me what it is?" She took in a large breath and nodded. "I am." Izuku watched with his eyes instead of his senses as a shimmering outline covered her skin. Slowly, Izuku could see her. She had pale skin with yellowish-green eyes and hair very similar to her mother. She had a beaming smile as Izuku's breath was taken away. He could only take in every detail of her visible face for a long moment. "I've only practiced by looking at my hands. I wanted you to be the first to see me," she said with a visible flush creeping into her cheeks. "What do you think?" she asked more shyly. Izuku could only grab her face and smiled brilliantly at her. "You're beautiful." Her face flushed red at his words and her eyes watered a bit. "And if I wasn't?" She asked jokingly. I still would have said so. He chuckled and kept taking in every detail of her. You still haven't seen yourself. Izuku quickly took out his phone, but Toru snatched it away and held it an arm's length away before taking a picture with the both of them in it. She flipped the phone around to see herself and took in a wobbly breath as she also took in every detail of her face. Her concentration failed and she was invisible again, but that didn't stop Toru from turning to Izuku and giving him a bone-cracking hug. He took the impact from her, nearly knocking him over, and hugged her in return. Thank you, Toru said into his chest. For what? He asked, confused, still holding her. You were the one who gave me the idea that my quirk wasn't just invisibility but light refraction, she said, pulling away but still holding his hands. He shook his head with a soft smile. It was only a matter of time until you figured it out yourself. They spend their time at the bench close to each other until it began to darken. Izuku and Toru walked with their arms hooked the whole way back to the campus. They returned just in time for dinner and sat with their friends for a meal before bed. Mina teased the details of their time outside the wall of the school. Everyone went to bed with Toru sneaking into Izuku's room once again. The two fell asleep soundly in each other's arms. Monday, Izuku was called by Fat Gum to meet him at a different location than the agency in his school uniform. He found that odd but followed instructions. He bumped into Tsuyu and Uraraka on their way to their internships as well and rode together to their destination. Isn't Ryukyu's agency in a different area? Izuku asked the two girls. Uraraka nodded. It is. She asked us to go to a different location today. Tsuyu pulled her phone out and showed the address. Izuku looked at it with furrowed brows and showed the girls his messages with Fat Gum and the same address. Hold on. The teen looked up the address to see if it was anywhere important and saw it was the location of the Night Eye agency. Izuku's frown deepens. It's All Might's old sidekick's agency. Tsuyu croaked softly and looked curious. Any ideas why? Izuku shook his head. Not that I know of. They rode in silence the rest of the way and walked together to the building marked on the map. Izuku went in first to state his paranoia and immediately saw by Fat Gum. Izuku opened the door completely for the others to walk in with him. The big hero turned to his intern and smiled brilliantly at him. Flux, good to see you again. And you brought friends. He looked at the two girls behind him and knelt to whisper into Izuku's ear. You can't just take your girlfriend with you to work. He looked over his head at the two girls. Which one is it? Or is it both? He looked at Izuku with wide eyes. Izuku, used to the hero's antics, pushed the man's face, which was almost touching his own, away and shook his head with a slight blush. She's back at the school. We're here with Ryukyu, Uraraka said with a slight blush of her own from overhearing the hero. The frog girl was croaking a small laugh at the friendly hero's behavior beside Uraraka. Why didn't you just say so? He stood with a smile and motioned them to the doors behind him. Here, have some. He offered a plate of food to the three. Izuku took a bite to appease the hero and the two girls follows his lead. They walked into a large room with many heroes scattered around talking softly with each other. Uraraka and Tsuyu walked over to Ryukyu and Nijire standing to the side after waving at Izuku. He gave them a nod and joined Fat Gum and Tamaki next to the table with food. He observed everyone in the room and brought up their profiles in his mind. There were many lower-ranked heroes, with Fat Gum and Ryukyu being the highest overall. Finally, he turned to the hero he is working under. What's all this about? Izuku asked. You'll see, the hero said with another plate of food before him. Izuku didn't have to wait long as Sir Night Eye opened the door with Mirio behind him and Aizawa at his side with a short old hero with a white and yellow costume on. Izuku was incredibly interested in the old man since Izuku didn't recognize him whatsoever. The old hero locked eyes with Izuku and he raised an eyebrow at the young man's intense observation. When he was done taking in everything he could from what he could glean, he turned to Mirio, who looked less chipper than usual and had bags under his eyes. Izuku ignored the stare of his homeroom teacher and focused on Sir Night Eye. Good, you are all here. We may begin. Sir motioned to the large meeting room behind him. Everyone filed into the room and found their seats. Sir explained why he asked for all of them to meet together. I've been investigating a Yakuza clan named the Shie Hassaikai for quite a while. They are a large manufacturer of trigger, a drug that amplifies a person's quirk over a short time. The reason I called you all here today was because of what we have found about the Shie Hassaikai. A week ago, Fat Gum's interns, Flux and Sun Eater, encounter a thug with a unique drug that he attempted to shoot at them. Thankfully, neither were exposed to it. But the lab found out about the fluid. Its main ingredient is human blood. There were many looks of disgust and confusion. What does this new drug do? Rocklock asked. Sir took in a long breath and said, it damages the quirk factor of the person exposed to the drug. There was an uproar of horror at the hearing there was such a drug. Izuku's mind spun up idea after idea on where that drug could be useful. His immediate thought was to use it on every prisoner in Tartaru and get rid of every threat that is wasting money just containing them. His mind came back to the thought of whose blood was in it. Do we know whose blood is in the drug? Izuku asked out loud for everyone to hear. All eyes turned to him and nodded in agreement with the question and turned to Sir. He pushed up his glasses and then spoke. We believe it belongs to Eri, supposed daughter of Overhaul, head of the Shie Hassaikai clan. The screen flipped to a picture of a girl of 5 with a hospital gown and bandages covering her arms and legs. A child? How dare they? Fat Gum roared in fury. Many other heroes joined in the uproar. Izuku's blood boiled at the idea of Eri being used like a blood bag. He looked up at the screen again and only saw desperation and fear about her future. He noticed Mirio flinch when Sir mentioned Eri. Izuku continued to stare at the upperclassman until he looked up to lock gazes with the absorber. Izuku could see the evident shame as the blonde looked down. Izuku absorbed the sound of the room until everyone looked around and saw his raised hand. He stopped his quirk when he got little sound energy and asked Sir, we are here to plan a raid on the compound and stop their manufacturing of trigger and this new drug, right? Why not save Eri and stop the production of the quirk erasing drug when there was a chance? Izuku's eyes snapped to Mirio, who looked even more ashamed at the moment. Why are children here? This is no place for them. Rocklock stated, looking between Izuku, Uraraka, and Tsuyu. Izuku ignored this since he knew Rocklock's profile and his proclivities about the safety of children. Instead, his eyes kept locked onto Sir's, waiting for an answer. The hero stared back at Izuku's eyes. If we took that chance, the Shie Hassaikai would have gone underground to continue their production of trigger. We could not have risked that chance. Izuku spoke immediately after. Trigger will always be manufactured by others, but this new drug could be stopped completely since the child's blood is the main ingredient. I doubt they are taking the blood humanely with the clear terror on her face. He pointed at the screen, another flinch from Mirio. The risk was too great if we were to take the child. Sir shook his head again. Fat Gum stood up next to Izuku. We're here to plan a raid. The sooner that child is safe, the better, he said, anger lacing his words. Izuku sat down with Fat Gum, both their emotions boiling with the same thoughts going through their heads about Eri suffering in that compound. They continued with the raid planning and learning about the 8 bullets and their profiles. Izuku paid close attention to everything he was shown. When they finished, the heroes dispersed to their agencies and the students gathered up downstairs. Izuku was still seething at having to wait for the raid to help Eri. They had little to no information about her, and Izuku wanted to interrogate Mirio about why he looked so ill every time Eri was brought up. Why did you react the way you did every time Eri was brought up? Everyone's eyes turned to him. On my patrol, Eri ran into me. She was trying to run away from Overhaul, he said with his eyes downcast. You let her go. Izuku seethed. What was I supposed to do? Mirio yelled out. With your speed, get Eri to safety and take out the head of the Shie Hassaikai. Izuku yelled back in fury. From what I've seen, you are a nightmare to any physical fights. No one can touch you if you don't want them to, and there are no obstacles for you. He finished with a hiss and glare. That's enough, Aizawa said loudly and used his quirk on everyone. Once everyone stopped and sat down again, he turned on Izuku. I'm tempted not to allow you to participate. For what reason? Your personal feeling. That's not very logical of you. I have not broken one rule of yours or Yue's, he said calmly and stared into Eraserhead's eyes. You have towed the line for a long time, and this doesn't include what you did to Muscular. He glared at his student. It was that or a dead child. I would have chosen it again, and I will if I have to with Overhaul, he said coldly as he stood up to meet his glare. What happened to Muscular? Uraraka asked, looking between Izuku and her teacher. I tried to get Koda to safety during the camp and Muscular caught up with us. We fought and he ended up between me and Koda. Anything I used on him might have hit Koda and he was too close to intercept from killing Koda. So I absorbed his electric energy and he ended up brain dead. Everyone seated gasped in horror. I would do it again if it meant Koda's safety. He turned his glare at Mirio, who looked sick at everything he had said. This is not helping your case, Aizawa said. Doing what's necessary to save Eri isn't helping my case?
Izuku spat back.
I do not trust you in this operation or any other, and I don't trust UA to keep us safe. Don't. Aizawa's glare sharpened. The two continued to glare at each other until Tsuyu spoke up. Midoriya is right. He has only done the right thing every time he needed. If it was between my younger siblings or that villain, I would have been all right with what he chose. Uraraka looked uneasy but nodded with her friend. I'll be participating in that raid, Izuku said with finality. One way or another. He pushed past Aizawa and out of the front doors to leave. He walked to the train station alone and thought of what he had learned that day. What he mainly thought about was Mirio and what kind person would let Eri go into Overhaul's hands to make things easier later on. His opinion on Sir was also lowered when he continued to have it his way only. When he met him over a year ago, he knew he was ridged but not to the point where it was only one option. Then he thought of Aizawa and UA. He wants to continue his studies and graduate UA, but their attitude towards him is making it difficult to stay. The biggest reason he is staying is because of Toru and his friends. He knows it's not completely safe at UA, but with the League of Villains still around, where is? Chapter 33. Rescue. Izuku returned to the dorms ahead of the others he left with. It was close to dark when he opened the doors to the common room where most of his classmates were. He had calmed down for the most part, but his thoughts kept going back to earlier that day and most importantly, Eri. He greeted his friends when they waved to him, but his tight smile was a dead giveaway to his emotions. Toru pulled Izuku to the open sofa and he sighed as he sat down. Sorry, just learned some things during the internship that bothered me. A lot, he said looking down. And I don't think I'm allowed to tell you guys. Not until it's past. Everyone nodded their heads and knew what their leader meant. They all had learned in school that sometimes there would be things they wouldn't be able to tell each other or loved ones due to security. Toru hooked their arms together and leaned on him. The other began to talk to him about what he had missed while he was gone. It wasn't much, but Izuku was grateful for their efforts. A few days passed with Izuku gritting his teeth with each day that passed with Eri still getting hurt in the Shie Hassaikai compound. He went to his patrol with Fat Gum every day, but Izuku could tell the hero was getting close to exploding due to the wait for the raid. Sun Eater looked more depressed than usual, and it was clear to see it was due to Mirio being down from guilt. How much trouble would we be in if we raided the compound ourselves? Izuku asked one day out of the blue to Fat Gum. He looked surprised at the question and shook his head reluctantly with a small smile. As tempted as I am to say, let's do it and charge in there, we would risk the chance of letting many of them get away and then regroup somewhere else. That's not to mention, we would need to find Eri with everyone against us. Izuku was quiet for a moment and then asked, what if we just wait for Eri to leave the compound and we snatch her up and I turn the compound to slag? He said darkly. Fat Gum froze and so did Tamaki. They both turned to stare at Izuku. Tamaki remembered what his underclassman revealed about his fight with Muscular and how it ended. The shy student wasn't so sure if Izuku was joking or not. Fat Gum was similarly thinking of what his file said about him and his previous unstable nature. Heroes kill only when it's necessary, not when it's the easier solution. Fat Gum lectured softly and stared at his plate of food. Izuku only hummed non-committally to him and kept eating his snack. It was a sunny day when the raid was to start. Izuku stared at the compound through the screen as he waited with Fat Gum, who was also anxious to start already. Tamaki had already eaten what he needed for his quirk and stared with the same anxious energy as Fat Gum. They had been briefed already about every important member of the Shie Hassaikai, including the two members of the League of Villains that joined for a reason the heroes weren't sure of yet. The police gave their go-ahead and the operation started with a knock on the door. It burst open with the help of one of the members of the 8 bullets. Flux jumps up with kinetic energy and absorbed the impact of one of the police officers who were launched back from Rakia. He landed softly and Eraserhead caught the other one before he was injured. Ryukyu transformed into her dragon form and fought head-on with the Yakuza lieutenant. Everyone else was ordered to rush in through the busted open entrance and proceed with the operation. Flux ran alongside the others as they followed Sir Night-Eye to a dead end where it was revealed to be a secret door after a push of a button. More Yakuza members charged out, but they were dealt with quickly by Bubble Girl and Eraserhead. They were stopped again at a dead end at the end of the corridor they ran through after the staircase. Lemillion phased his head through the wall in front of them and then pulled back and punched the wall to reveal the rest of the passageway. They soon stopped again due to the room warping around. Izuku recognized Mimic's quirk and was beginning to grow frustrated at the idea of losing Eri and letting Overhaul continue his experiments. Izuku reached out with his senses to see if he could find where Mimic was hiding. "Flux, what are you doing?" Eraserhead all but growled at his student for walking off. The room began to violently move around to stop Flux when he got closer to a wall. He jumped up and dug his fingers into the wall with the help of thermal energy melting a handhold. A kinetic shockwave shattered the thin wall and revealed Mimic's shocked face. He tried to sink in deeper to run away from Flux's angry eyes, but he was frozen when Eraserhead erased his quirk. Flux quickly shattered the stone around Mimic's body and zapped him until he was unconscious. He tossed the limp body down to Fat Gum and he handcuffed him with quirk suppression cuffs. "Great job, Flux," Fat Gum praised his in turn. "Now, let's move on before they get away." Everyone nodded and they made their way down the corridors. Tamaki split off to stop 3 other members of the 8 bullets and Flux assisted him by shooting a lightning bolt at the biggest of the 3 who Flux thought would give Sun Eater the most trouble. The rest of the group ran along with a few petty clan members trying to stop or slow them down. Fat Gum was pushed to the side when 2 of the 8 bullets stepped in. Izuku's eyes lit up at the opportunity before him. "Fat Gum, I can take them. You think you're a match for me? Let's see then." Kendo roared and punched the short teen multiple times with his quirk. Izuku took each punch and absorbed the energy with an eager smile that chilled most people who saw it. "I'm not leaving a new intern alone here. Go on, we've got it here," Fat Gum said and stepped next to Izuku. The rest of the raid ran ahead while Izuku stared at Kendo and the man with a gray robe behind him. Flux stepped forward after throwing his jacket to the side. Kendo took this in stride and threw a barrage of punches at the smaller teen. Each impact was negated and absorbed into his core. He continued to step forward while accepting each punch. "Now, this is a good challenge," Kendo roared in joy. Hikiji Tengai was wary of the young hero whose face didn't change. "Something is wrong, get back." His shield was covering the 2 of them. Izuku's smile only grew wider at the energy before him. He placed his palm against the yellow dome, stopping him from getting past to save Eri. He started slowly by taking a small amount of the shield before him. Under his hand, the bright yellow dimmed in its light. The man who conjured the dome looked in horror as the dome began to dim more and more. He poured more of his energy into reinforcing the dome, but he felt shivers at the smile hidden behind his mask of the boy who took it all in. "Mine," Flux said gleefully and yanked all the energy Tengai had. The Yakuza man collapsed to the ground, shocking Kendo. "What did you do?" he asked, stepping away slightly at the unknown. Fat Gum also wanted to know himself. "I think I caused him to go into quirk exhaustion from taking all the energy he produces at once," Izuku said, interested in the outcome, and then played with his new energy by shaping a globe of yellow energy in his hand. "Magnificent," he whispered to himself as he studied the energy, then locked eyes with Kendo, who looked unsure for the first time in a long time. "How many of your punched can you take?" "All of them." Kendo tried to rile himself up again. He charged forward and continued his barrage of punches. "Fight me!" The next punch that landed felt wrong, and the next thing he knew was that he was across the room and his arm was shattered. "You took about 70 of your punches," Flux stated as he walked up to Kendo's prone form. "Do you yield?" Kendo groaned in agony as he clutched his arm. He looked up to meet eyes with the forest green eyes that stared down at him. "I was never a challenge, was I?" "No, you were a source of energy like your comrade over there," Flux said coldly and handcuffed his legs to save him from suffering the pain of moving his arm. Fat Gum stared at his intern and approached him. You weren't joking about turning this whole compound into slag, were you? I have a lot of thermal energy, Izuku said by explanation. Let's catch up, he said as he heard a rumble from ahead. Flux and Fat Gum walked into a large room in full battle. Eraserhead was drunkenly fighting against someone with an alcohol bottle in hand while trying to keep Overhaul from using his quirk. Lemillion fought against Overhaul, but he was handicapped by trying to protect Sir, who was bleeding profusely to the side. Another man was running off with Eri in hand while keeping an eye on the battle. I'm getting Eri, Flux said and blasted off to cut them off. Fat Gum cursed and ran to help Eraserhead so he could focus more properly on Overhaul. Flux flew above the battle between Overhaul and Lemillion. The Yakuza head saw where he was going and was able to use his quirk to erect a wall of spikes to impale him in midair. A wave of sound energy that rattled everyone shattered the stone spikes, and a blast of kinetic caused the debris to open a path for Flux. He heard Overhaul roar in anger, but his focus was on Eri's scared wide eyes. Chronostasis turned around with a gun in hand at the sound of his leader roaring in anger. He saw why Overhaul was enraged and he was headed straight for him. He aimed the quirk-erasing loaded gun at the student and fired once thinking it would be enough. He landed before him and the girl in his arm and held where he was shot. The member of the 8 bullets smirked, but his smile fell away when the green-haired boy pulled the intact syringe and examined it before his eyes snapped to him. He put it away and then the void encompasses everything around him. He wasn't able to hear or see, and his only saving grace was that his legs were already spread out and balanced. He tried to look around, but he saw nothing. He felt the girl struggle to get away from his tight grip, but he gripped tighter in growing panic. Flux dashed forward under the waving gun and to Chronostasis's side. He gripped the gun, and a quick application of thermal energy caused it to turn to slag with his pointer finger still in the guard. He quickly went around to his other side and pulled Eri from his loosened grip due to his instinct to clutch at his incinerated finger. With Eri in hand, Flux kicked Chronostasis in the back with a kinetic blast and launched him toward the battle of Overhaul and Lemillion. He dropped the void domain when he felt Eri begin to breathe in rapidly in panic and not knowing what was going on. Izuku pulled off his gas mask and set Eri down in front of him. It's okay, he said softly to calm her down. We're here to get you to safety and away from them. I'm Izuku. You're safe, I promise. Eri's breathing steadied, and then she began to understand what he was saying. She began to cry at his words and then began to panic again when her quirk began to lash out at the emotions she was feeling. She tried to push away from Izuku. No, get away. You'll disappear. Her horn flared up in a golden light. Izuku sensed the new energy before him, instead of what he did earlier with the villain and yanking all the energy to him. He slowly began to take it in to negate its effects. No, it won't, it can't hurt me. See, Izuku said with a smile and raised his hand as the golden energy was sucked into his palm. Eri stared transfixed at the energy getting pulled into Izuku's hand and then looked back at him. He wasn't disappearing as everyone else did. Just calm down, all right? And try to close off your quirk. Can you do that for me? Eri shakily nodded and clenched her eyes shut and focused on stopping like she had done before. It took a moment, but Izuku's hand on her shoulder helped greatly. When she opened her eyes, Izuku was beaming proudly at her and the energy was gone. Please don't leave me, she asked desperately with more tearing erupting from her eyes. Izuku kept his smile but was saddened inside at the desperation of her plea. I won't. I'll stay by your side. She clutched at his arm and then paled when she looked behind him. He also turned around to see Overhaul charging straight at them with a monstrosity of a body. He passed over Chronostasis's unconscious body and touched him and assimilated him into the body that once was Overhaul. Lemillion was doing everything he could to stop him, but the limp arms looked wrong and his kicks were doing minimal damage to the monster. Izuku stood up and pulled Eri behind him. Run, Eri cried. Izuku looked down and smiled reassuringly. It's okay. I told you you were safe. Izuku's smile fell as he turned to Overhaul, who was right not far from them. He raised his hand and a bead of nuclear immolation coalesced in his palm. The fire that spilled out carved through Overhaul's chest and melted a large chunk of the wall behind him. The room heated up drastically, except for the area right around Eri. Overhaul stumbled and fell over before slapping one of his hands on himself and repairing the hole that should have been his spine and heart. Before Overhaul could use his quirk on the ground to impale everything, a lightning bolt that would have made the god of lightning proud struck him in the head and he collapsed once again without getting up or moving. Izuku kept watching the villain to make sure it wouldn't move again for another moment and then lowered his hand. He quickly raised it again and shielded Eri when the roof collapsed with Ryukyu and Rikia tumbling down. The villain was almost the same size as the hero due to his quirk absorbing the stamina of everyone around him. Originally, his quirk was touch-based, but it had been enhanced due to the trigger he took earlier. Everyone could see Rikia continuously getting bigger as he wrestled with Ryukyu, and Izuku saw another opportunity before him. He sensed the energy just under his range and he pulled it. He felt the third new energy settle into his core, and he was ecstatic at the possibilities that opened up before him. He began drawing Rikia's energy to himself. The villain was enjoying himself in the battle, but felt something wrong immediately. He began to shrink as his energy was sucked away. He whipped his head in the direction where it was headed, and he met eyes with a smirking green-haired boy. He didn't get a chance to fight him as he felt exhaustion settle in and darkness take him. Everyone underground watched as Rikia collapsed face down trying to reach Izuku, who stood shielding Eri from anyone that got too close. The little girl, for her part, stared in awe as Izuku took out some of the strongest Yakuza leaders with little effort. Ryukyu looked confused at what happened before her, but quickly moved and placed quirk suppression cuffs on the man. Izuku knelt again at Eri's side and smiled. "Let's get you out of here." She nodded and was picked up by Izuku. She clung to him as they made their way closer to everyone else. Fat Gum looked slimmer but still big as he ran up to his intern and Eri. She held tighter as the big hero approached more carefully as he got close. "Flux, glad to see you're all right." "Hello, Eri. You can call me Fat Gum." He smiled brilliantly at her. She nestled closer to Izuku and warily watched the hero. "He's okay. I worked with him to get you out." She turned at Izuku's voice and relaxed just a bit. Fat Gum nodded with a softer smile and guided them to the exit. Izuku held Eri tight as they passed through the corridors that were her waking nightmare. They slowed when they passed an open metal door with a child's bed inside. Izuku asked her if she'd like to grab anything, and she shook her head while covering her face in his jacket. They moved on. They reached the surface and the flurry of activity around them as clan members were being thrown into police vans with paramedics and firefighters at the ready to help where they were needed. They moved to the paramedics and Izuku hesitated when he realized he would need to let Eri go. "Fat Gum, I'll be staying with Eri," he stated. The hero looked between Flux's set face and Eri's hands clutching to his jacket. "That would be for the best. I'll meet you at the hospital later." Fat Gum nodded and moved to the ambulance to tell the men what was going to happen with Eri and Izuku. They boarded the back of the ambulance and Eri reluctantly let herself get checked up by the gentlewoman as they rode to the hospital. Izuku declined a checkup since he wasn't hurt in any way during the raid. His mind did go back to Sir Night Eye and Lemillion, who were both injured. Sir was out of the fight from the beginning when Izuku arrived, and Lemillion looked like his arms were shattered for some reason. He was curious about his classmates, but he didn't see them in the brief walk to the ambulance. Izuku focused back on Eri on his lap as she held tight to him. He worried about what will happen to her if they decide to separate her from him and she loses control of her quirk again without him being near. Eri looked up at Izuku's face and he smiled reassuringly as they rode in relative silence. She leaned against his chest and Izuku placed his arm around the child to comfort her as much as he could. Chapter 34 Eri. Eri held tightly to Izuku as he walked into the hospital to have her looked over. Once she realized where they were going and who would be there, she began to sob. Izuku stopped walking and knelt in front of her with worry filling his face. "What's wrong? I don't want to see doctors. They hurt me." She sobbed and began to back away. "The doctors you've met aren't doctors. They are supposed to help and heal you, not hurt you. And if they ever try to hurt you, I'll stop them. How about that?" Eri looked unsure as she peeked behind him to see further into the hospital, but then her eyes turned to his softly smiling face. "You promise?" "I do promise," he said, beaming at her. He held his arms out to pick her up and she settled into them immediately. They caught up with the nurse that was escorting them to a room and continued their path to it. After a bit of walking, they stopped in front of a room and the nurse opened the door for them. Izuku walked in carrying Eri and sat her down on the bed while he pulled up a chair close to her. Eri looked around the room with wariness. Seeing this, Izuku offered his hand for her to hold, and she did so instantly. Izuku stayed at her side the whole time as a few doctors came in to examine her for anything they could help with and heal. She began to get anxious at the doctor looking her over, and Izuku noticed her horn begin to glow softly. He raised his hand to stop the doctors from continuing and interposed himself to have Eri just see him. He began to absorb the wisps of energy that leaked off her horn and held her to his chest. They aren't hurting you. If they did, I would make them disappear. You're safe. He continued to say as her breathing calmed down and her horn stopped glowing. Maybe it would be for the best for one doctor at a time? He looked over his shoulder at the three that were looking her over. The three looked at each other and nodded. That probably would be for the best. The one on the right said and stayed as the other two left. Izuku stayed with Eri on the bed as the doctor who stayed looked her over and cleaned her up. They replaced the bandages on her limbs and got her a new gown that wasn't stained. Eri had her face in Izuku's chest as they removed the bandages, and he stroked her hair to distract her. Soon the doctor was done and Eri lay under the bed sheets and was dozing off. Izuku had gotten off the bed and was in her line of sight. "Izuku?" Eri asked. He turned to her. "Yeah, Eri, what's going to happen to me?" She pulled the sheets closer to her face and asked tentatively. Izuku paused and thought about it. "I'm not entirely sure, but I will make sure you go to a good place." She was quiet for a long moment. "Can't I stay with you?" she asked hopefully. Izuku froze and thought about the logistics of doing such a thing as taking care of a young child while at school. "I'm not sure, but I will try and ask." He did think of the benefits of Eri staying with him due to her quirk and her attachment to Izuku. He could safely teach her how to control her quirk, and with the benefit that she trusts him. He had to admit he was beginning to grow attached to her as well. Eri nodded and slowly drifted off to sleep. Izuku stayed in his chair with his jacket hanging to the side. He pulled his phone out and messaged his friends about the situation and his condition. They sent a barrage of texts back and he answered them all. He sat there in the room with Eri asleep thinking about Eri's request. He was unsure of watching over a child her age and being responsible for her, but he was sure he could help with her quirk. After all, he had studied quirks for all of his life, and he even her energy in his core to experiment safely before she tried something. Thinking of her energy, he analyzed it in his core with his other energies. It was a quirk energy like the explosive energy from the man on his internship. It was unique and mostly likely only obtained from the person's quirk. Not like thermal or light, which was everywhere. The new energy was oddly contained, unlike lightning, which always wanted to escape and spread. Eri's quirk energy moved slowly inside his core as he felt at it. Slowly, he brought his hand out and released a small amount of it. It escaped his hand and shimmered in the air before dissipating. To Izuku, it was pretty. He looked around the room and found a pen. He snatched it and used the energy on the writing tool, but nothing happened. He examined the pen to see if there were any differences, and he didn't find any. He tested its durability, its flexibility, and its ability to write. Izuku frowned and then thought about how some quirks only work on biological objects and not inanimate ones, like healing quirks. He looked around again and found a plant on the windowsill. He went to it and used a drop of energy on it and watched it carefully. Nothing happened. He frowned again and felt at the plant. He threw his hands up in the air when he felt it was plastic. For the moment, he gave up on the experiment and sat down again. Just as he did, he sensed a large thermal signature open the door just a bit, and Izuku raised an eyebrow at the smiling face of his boss. Fat Gum waved for him to come, and Izuku got up to do so. He closed the door quietly behind him and looked up at the hero. "How's she doing?" he asked first. Izuku shrugged. "Alive but not well mentally or physically. Malnutrition and multiple scars across her limbs," he said in one long and angry breath. Fat Gum's face screwed up in a snarl at the thought. "They will rot in prison. Better off if they were dead. It's a waste of resources to keep them alive," Izuku said with a neutral tone. Fat Gum stared at him for a moment and then said, "We aren't judge, jury, and executioners. It is the job of heroes to stop the villain, and we did so. Izuku looked away and hummed non-committally. He nodded at the statement and kept the rest of his thoughts to himself. He looked back to the hero and asked, "What of everyone else?" "Sir was unconscious when I last saw him, and Lemillion looked in bad shape too." Fat Gum went with the change of subject. "Sir Night Eye had a severe concussion and deep lacerations on his body. The doc thinks he will be alright, but he is still unconscious. Lemillion's arms were completely shattered from his quirk. He will be alright after some time." Izuku frowned at Mirio's condition. How could Mirio's quirk cause him to break his arms like that? His quirk allows him to become intangible and, from what he understands, ejects him out when he is in space with another object. He couldn't have broken his arms to that degree from using his quirk wrong, and on top of that, he is one of the top 3. He had become masterfully skilled in using his quirk. How? How what? Fat Gum asked. How did he shatter his arms? Did you see it? It was odd. I saw lightning arc around him, and then he punched Overhaul with incredible force when he merged with one of the others. It was like All Might through the punch, he said, impressed. But afterward, his arm was purple and wrong. He did it again with his other arm soon after. Izuku hummed in thought and didn't say anything more. Unless his quirk evolved, Mirio shouldn't have been able to do such a thing as punch with the force of All Might. His mind went back to the fight between All Might and the villain with multiple quirks. "What is it?" Fat Gum asked with furrowed brows. Izuku shook his head. "Just a thought." He looked back at the door to Eri's room. "What's going to happen to her?" Fat Gum sighed. "We're not entirely sure just yet. Normally, we'd look for any living relatives to take her in. Next would be an orphanage if there aren't any viable people. But I get the feeling that it won't be that simple. Her quirk is volatile, and I'm not sure what it does just yet." He showed the contained energy in his hand. "She seems very wary of everyone but me too." "What are you saying?" Izuku sighed and rubbed his scarred shoulder. "She asked me if she could stay with me, and I don't know what to do. I want to help her, but I don't know how to accomplish that. I could watch over her in case her quirk is out of her control, and she seems to trust me. What I'm trying to say is, can you help me?" he asked earnestly. Fat Gum smiled softly down at him and grabbed his shoulder to look at him. "I'll see what I can do. You seem attached to Eri already." Izuku smiled and looked away. "I can help her," he said simply. "Thanks, Fat Gum." He released Izuku and patted his hair. "Go get some rest for the time being." He quietly opened the door to Eri's room. Izuku nodded and went to his chair to sit down. He got comfortable and relaxed some while watching Eri shift in her bed. He decided to copy her and take a nap as well. Took a while, but he soon dozed off to sleep. He was awoken an hour later by the beeping of the machine attached to Eri to monitor her heart rate. The rapid rate of the noise sent Izuku into fighting mode right away. He looked at the little girl first and saw that she was breathing rapidly and backing away from nothing in particular. A nightmare. Izuku quickly went over to her and got in her line of vision before talking. "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You're safe, remember?" He slowly got to her side to not scare her. Eri looked around frantically until her eyes landed on Izuku. She flinched when the door was thrown open by a nurse, but the woman slowed when she saw Izuku hovering over Eri. "Nightmare?" she asked softly. Izuku nodded and she left quietly. His attention went back to Eri when he heard her start crying. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened his arm to give the option of some comfort. She looked at him for a moment and then hesitantly under one arm for a hug. Izuku gently lowered his arm and held her snugly against him. She slowly relaxed under his arm and her crying came to a slow. After a long moment, Eri looked up at the one who protected her from Overhaul. Izuku looked down at her when he caught her staring and smiled softly. Eri's eyes roamed around him until they stopped at his shoulder. "You have scars," she stated. Izuku moved his free arm to show better. "I do," he agreed. "Did bad men do that too?" she asked quietly. Izuku thought about that for a moment. "Something like that." He nodded. "They can't hurt me anymore." Eri nodded at that explanation. "Eri, do you have any family? Mother? Father?" he asked slowly. Eri looked down in her head. "My curse made Papa disappear and Mama didn't want me anymore," she said with tears beginning to leak again. Curse? You don't have a curse, what you have is a quirk. Most everyone has one, yours is just dangerous. But there are lots of different types of quirks. He stopped before going on to a lecture on quirks. We just have to help you control your quirk and it won't be so dangerous. Quirk, she said softly. You have a quirk? I do, he said nodding. Wanna see? Eri nodded curiously and Izuku held out his hand. In the palm of his hand grew a ball of light. He shifted it to the void and then each one to show her a light show. I can absorb energies and use them later. Your quirk uses some kind of energy and I absorb to help you. He finished by showing a ball of her quirk energy. Eri's eyes watched in fascination at the display. Pretty. For the rest of the time, Izuku sat with Eri and let her play with the energy he produced. She swiped her fingers through the void energy and tried to grab the light ball that flicked to each finger. The most interesting one was one of the new energies he had gotten that day. He is calling it shield energy since the main focus was to use it as a shield. When he projected the energy, it naturally shaped a sphere with a hollow interior. He was sure if he expanded the energy, it could cover his whole body. It was an added defensive move to the power set. Eri played with the energy like a ball. She held it gently in her hands, and then it disappeared in her hands and absorbed back into Izuku's skin. He reformed the ball and she took it again. Sometime later, there was a knock at the door and Mirio peeked inside. Izuku felt Eri tense at seeing who it was. She shivered just a bit and Izuku held her close to him. Mirio stepped inside with a beaming smile. His arms were wrapped up in bandages but healed. Tamaki and Nijire came in behind him. Izuku felt Eri's hand tighten around his hand which she was playing with just a moment ago. He observed the three, they all seemed fine for the most part. They were healed up, but Izuku could see the tension in Mirio's shoulders. Hello, I'm happy to finally meet you, Mirio exclaimed just a bit too loud which caused Eri to flinch. My name is Lemillion. You left me, Eri said with tears beginning to leak and her shaking intensifying. Mirio's smile broke, but he tried to hold it on his face. It reminded him of All Might on the rooftop so long ago. Mirio, I think it's best if you leave, Izuku said. His smile broke entirely and he stepped forward to explain himself and Eri flinched again. Izuku used his new shield energy to form a dome around the bed they were on. Mirio bumped into it and backed away. The shield was absorbed and Izuku stared harshly at Mirio. Mirio finally nodded with his teeth clenched and turned to leave. Better work on that quirk of yours. It would work great with the one you were born with. In the end, Izuku's eyes switched to Nijire as her shoulders tensed. Mirio whirled around again and stared at Izuku, but his face remained neutral. I'll see you later, Tamaki. He turned dismissively from Mirio and to the ever-quiet boy beside Mirio. The three looked at each other and had a wordless conversation before leaving with Mirio giving one last look over his shoulder. Izuku watched them with his sixth sense, but his focus was on Eri who was crying. He rocked her back and forward in an attempt to soothe her. Why? She sobbed. Izuku looked down at her. Why what? Why did he leave me? She asked softly. Because he thought it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't. He should have done more to try and help, but he let you go, Izuku said harshly looking at the door. Eri was quiet for a long moment and then asked, What would you do? Burn Overhaul into ash so he could hurt anyone else ever again. And then take you to safety, Izuku said immediately, his mind going back to Muscular and how he would never hurt anyone again, even if there would be another prison break. But killing is bad, Eri said. Izuku nodded. It is bad, but I'd rather do bad things to help good people. Eri took that in and stayed near Izuku's chest and the warmth he radiated. He formed another ball of energy and handed it to her. She took it and played around with it in her hands until she began to drift off to sleep again. Izuku stayed by her side for as long as he could. Chapter 35, Energies. You promise you will come back? Eri asked with tears cropping her eyes. I will, but I'm sorry I have to go so soon. I have school and they aren't letting me stay. I will be back to visit until the hospital decides to let you leave too, Izuku said while looking her in the eye to reassure her. He thought for a moment and then he took off his jacket and placed it next to her. Hold on to this for me. After all, one way to make sure I come back is to come back for my jacket." He finished with a smile. Eri took the jacket in her small hands. She looked up and nodded with more reassurance. "Okay." With that, Izuku patted her head gently and turned to leave out the door. It was the next day after the raid. Izuku had stayed the night in Eri's room like he had stayed in Turu's room when she recovered. The girl had a few nightmares during the night and one quirk outburst that Izuku had taken care of easily. When Eri realized that she wasn't in Overhaul's lab anymore, she calmed down. Eraserhead came in before the sun had set to see Eri and his student. The two had spoken while the little girl had looked warily at the unshaven man. Izuku told her he was a hero and she calmed down, but she still stared at the underground hero. The two spoke about what Izuku wanted with Eri and what Nizu thought about it. They were already thinking of taking Eri to UA before Izuku asked Fat Gum for his favor. Aizawa explained what they had planned and how he was going to be her main caretaker for the fact that he could erase her quirk. They added Izuku into the plan when Fat Gum spoke to Nizu about his favor. Nizu decided it would be an added benefit to Eri's mental health to keep Izuku near her while she reigned in her quirk. It was even more beneficial when Izuku told them about him being able to absorb her quirk energy to negate it just as easily as Eraserhead. They still haven't told Eri about what was the plan going forward. Izuku traveled to the dorms with Tsuyu and Uraraka after they had been released the same morning. The two girls asked about Eri and how she was doing on the train ride. He told them readily about her well-being. Izuku had grown to trust the two over the school year with Tsuyu's blunt nature and Uraraka's earnest behavior. The friction between Izuku and Ida didn't affect her attitude towards Izuku, which he appreciated. When the three walked through the dorm's front doors, they were immediately greeted by the class who was in the common room. Izuku was mobbed by Toru and the others in the gang of friends. "Great to see you again," Denki said with a beaming smile. "Toru over here was checking her phone every 5 minutes. So much she missed you." Mina teased with a giggle as she looked him over. Toru ignored her in favor of burying her face in Izuku's chest while her arms were wrapped around him tightly. Izuku automatically did the same to her. The group moved to the common room. Izuku sat in the middle of them all as they waited for him to talk about what was going on. He did so and told them about how the raid went and the outcome. He told them about Eri and what he wanted for her. All of them realized quickly why he became attached to the child when they looked at their similarities. Izuku was abandoned because of his lack of a quirk, and Eri was abandoned because of her quirk. A quirk that he could help her with by the sounds of it. None of them brought up their thoughts but listened attentively to him. He finished with a sigh after telling them why he stayed the night at the hospital. Denki was the one to speak first. "That really sucks," he said with a sigh. The others nodded along. "Can we see her next time you go to visit?" Toru asked. Izuku hummed in contemplating. "I'm not sure that's a good idea right now. It might be overwhelming to meet new people so soon after what happened." Toru nodded dejectedly. "That makes sense." They stayed quiet for a moment until Hanta asked with a curious smile. "So, how many new energies did you get?" Mina looked excitedly at Izuku after his question. "Yeah. You mentioned something about getting new energy." Izuku was happy to show them his spoils of war. He started with the shield energy. "A form of shield energy. Pretty strong, and I can absorb what I use, so there is no loss." He created a small ball that grew to cover his hand. Denki tapped the orange energy. "Cool," he gasped. "Can you make a hamster ball with this and roll around with it?" he asked with glee. Izuku paused and looked at everyone, and they looked back at him. While he did want to try it out, it seemed embarrassing to act like a child. Toru saw his trepidation and yanked him up and to the backyard. The others were on their heels with childish excitement. Izuku, with red cheeks, formed a ball of energy around himself just big enough to stand. Denki and Mina immediately pushed the sphere of orange energy, which led Izuku to fall inside the sphere as it moved. He absorbed the impact, but the two didn't stop. They kept pushing as Izuku tried to find a way to keep himself from getting tossed around the hamster ball. Hanta and Toru were laughing as Izuku cursed his two friends, who kept pushing him around as they cackled in joy. He absorbed the energy surrounding him, which caused Denki and Mina to tumble forward and land on top of Izuku, who was disheveled by getting rolled around for a good few minutes. He groaned as Denki pushed himself off of Izuku and Mina off of Denki. They could only hear the howling laughter of Hanta and Toru, who watched on. After they had calmed down, they regrouped to see what else Izuku had to play around with. Not sure how strong it is, but the guy I took it from was pretty confident about it. How much did you take? Mina asked. Izuku felt around in his core, and it was hard to put it into a measurement. A lot? I made him go into Quirk exhaustion by yanking it all at once. Everyone looked confused. Hanta was the one to voice the question on everyone's mind. How? It was a theory I had that if someone had an energy quirk and I pulled everything they had, either they would go into quirk exhaustion because of the quirk trying to push out everything at once, or I would kind of short out their quirk and they would need to start using it from the beginning again. Like a flame snuffed out, they would need to light it again after I blew it out. He rambled on into his thoughts while he rolled around a globe of shield energy in his hands. So if you yanked all my electricity out, then I would go into quirk exhaustion? See, Denki asked. Not sure about that. Electricity in the body is very delicate and yours shouldn't be any different. I'm not sure how separated your quirk electricity and your natural electricity is intertwined. If I yanked one, would the other come too? Like muscular. Oh right, that makes sense. Denki nodded with a grin expression. Enough of that, what else do you get? Mina broke the thick silence immediately. Izuku smiled and showed off the next energy. This is from a villain who was boosted by Trigger. His original quirk was a touch-based stamina drain that converted to strength. With Trigger, it became ranged and I was able to snag some of it, and now it's new base energy that I can absorb from others. He released some of the orange light energy from his hand. I haven't tested it out much, but I can sense the same energy in all of you guys and everyone inside too. Denki leaned forward and swiped his hand through the energy. He sat rigidly as he took some of the energy. Whoa, that's like 10 cups of coffee. He sat up fully alert. Denki, that could have been dangerous. Izuku admonished his friend but looked on curiously. As he saw the energy he released merge with the rest of his stamina. A boosting effect, he said to himself in thought. Let me try. Let me try. Mina asked eagerly. Izuku reluctantly let some leak out of his finger where Mina swiped her hand across. The same effect happened to her and Mina sat up with a splitting grin. No more sleep. This is not a replacement for sleep. I'm not sure how it would affect you if you did. Izuku released some more stamina energy when Toru pinched his arm when she wanted to try it as well. He looked at her with narrowed eyes, but Toru's pouting face broke Izuku immediately at seeing it. And then this energy, Izuku said while holding it away from everyone in his palm. It radiated golden white light. For the brief moment he released some of it. It's Ares quirk energy, but I don't know what it does. It doesn't affect non-organic material as far as I could tell, and I'm wary to try it on a person when she said it made people disappear. Let's find a plant. Mina bolted from her seat with boosted stamina still in her body. Yay! Denki nodded eagerly. Hanta looked to Izuku. Never give them that stuff again, he said seriously. He looked at the three who absorbed some of the stamina energy and had to agree. Toru was vibrating in her seat while hugging Izuku's arm. Mina was running from one place to another looking for a plant, and Denki was shooting off sparks at a constant rate. He decided Denki had enough before he shocked someone by accident and pulled gently at his stamina until he was back to normal. It was evident when the effects wore down when his quirk eased up and he sat more relaxed. That was a rush, Denki said with a hand to his head. That'll be great to boost someone before fighting. Izuku nodded with him at the application and thought about what else he could use it for when Mina almost slammed a potted plant on the table they sat at in the backyard. Plant, Mina declared while hopping from foot to foot. The dwindling stamina Izuku gave her was taken away and she slumped. Ah, no fun. Toru pouted again when her excess stamina was drained as well. All right, just one drop of that energy. Izuku detached himself from Toru just in case and placed his hand over the plant. The golden white energy flowed out and touched the plant. Before everyone's eyes, it shrunk to a younger state of its life cycle. Oh, Izuku could only say. Everyone stared at the plant that was at least a few weeks younger than it was just a moment ago. Time travel energy? Mina was the first to shout out. Nah. I don't want anything to do with time travel. That stuff freaks me out. Hanta put up his hands in surrender and backed away. That's so cool. Toru said, leaning forward to examine the plant. Izuku didn't listen to any of them as he was lost in his head while mumbling to himself about the applications of such an energy. Before he could lose himself any further, Denki zapped his arm. Ow! What? Izuku rubbed at the spot and Mach glared at Denki. For his part, the electric user smirked. Just making sure you didn't go comatose or something, he said with a shrug. I'll make you go comatose, Izuku mumbled back. He turned his attention back to the plant and hummed in thought. He sighed in frustration and rubbed his face at what he had thought. I have to tell Aizawa to make sure they know how dangerous Aries Quirk could be. More so to make sure there is enough security around her just in case. The other four moods dipped at that realization. If it was known that Aries Quirk could reverse time on a person, who knows who would try to snatch her up. Izuku had to admit having her come to UA would be the best, even though he didn't fully trust them. Since the beginning of the year when he found Katsuki sitting at that desk in their classroom, he began to doubt UA's logic and reasoning. From there, the USJ happened with him ending up with a psychological evaluation because he decided to put a stop to the most dangerous villain in that building. Then the training camp happened with the League of Villains knowing where they were located. That alone screamed red flags in terms of security. He would have thought of going to another school like Ketsubutsu Academy or Shiketsu High School after that, but he couldn't leave the only people he thought of as friends and Toru. He even liked some of his other classmates, and leaving UA would mean he would be back to step one like the first day of UA. Any of you have his number? Izuku asked, looking at his friends. They shook their heads in the negative. With a mournful sigh, he got up from his seat in the backyard. I suppose I have to be social and ask other people. Toru giggled at his dramatics. Both Denki and Hanta nodded with a somber expression. Such a fate. A cruel fate, the two said. They chuckled and followed a grinning Izuku inside. The absorber stopped grinning when he saw the TV on the news station. The reporter was talking about how a police convoy was attacked and everyone was killed. They were transporting Overhaul to the Tartarus when ambushed by villains that left burnt bodies and ash. Yaoruzo, do you have Aizawa's phone number? Izuku asked the girl on the couch with some of his classmates. She looked oddly at him. You don't have it already? Why would I? Izuku asked, confused. Never mind, here. She passed him her phone with Aizawa's number pulled up. He copied the number onto his and thanked her for her help. He went over to the backyard with the others staying behind to let him have some privacy. Izuku stared at the number on his phone for a bit, but in the end, he hit the call button with a scowl. It rang 3 times before someone picked up on the other end. Who is this? Aizawa's voice was monotone as he answered. Izuku Midoriya, I found out what Aries Quirk does, or at least the energy, he said with no preamble. It was quiet for a moment, but there was a quiet sigh and some rustling. Come to Gym Gamma. And then he hung up. Izuku scowled even further at his phone as the line was disconnected. With a huff of air, he peeked inside to tell his friends that he was headed to meet with their homeroom teacher. With that done, he went back inside and untied his shoes. In his bare feet, he walked a small distance away from the building and then blasted into the air with kinetic energy. He kept going for a long time until he could see all of UA and its surroundings. He just stopped and took it all in as he fell back to the earth. Between the sun setting on the horizon and the curvature of the earth, it was a breathtaking scene. He thought Toru might like it and snapped a picture and then sent it to her. He fell for a while until it became easier to see the sections of the UA grounds. He found Gym Gamma and reoriented himself to blast to the entrance. He sped up until he reached the ground. He extended his hand before ending up splattering on the ground and absorbing the impact to come to a stop. He got his feet underneath him and crouched down with his hand still on the ground. He stood up and didn't see anyone yet, so he sat down on the ground. He had a ball of the shield energy in hand and then began to experiment. First, he put the shield under enough pressure for it to break apart using kinetic energy from his hands on opposite sides of the ball. It shattered like glass and then dissipated into the air. He tried to absorb the energy of the shards, but he got little back. He nodded along with his theory being correct about losing energy if it breaks. Next, he made another ball of shield energy. This time he added different energies to see if the result would be any different, but none of them did. Quirk energy has always been too unique to mesh with other energies. Izuku finished his experiments by trying to contain thermal energy inside the ball to make a fire bomb of sorts, but it ended up breaking under the pressure of the contained heat. Finally, he sensed someone approaching and looked up to see Aizawa watching him as he got closer. Izuku stayed on the ground and stared back until he was a few feet away. Aizawa sighed and rubbed his face after staring at each other for so long. Why is it so hard for you to trust us? Because you haven't given me any reason to trust any of you. We are your teachers. My past teachers are all in jail. He cut him off from finishing. He didn't continue and got up to walk to the entrance of the gym. He heard Aizawa follow him with thinned lips before Izuku stopped in front of a tree. How old do you think this tree is? Aizawa furrowed his brow but gave out an answer. 30 years, maybe? I'm not an arborist. Izuku let some of Aries' energy out of his hand and into the tree. It visibly shrunk, and the branches got closer to its trunk with the roots in the ground retracting. How about now? They stared at a much smaller tree, 10 years younger at least. He looked grim as he stared at the tree. Izuku stared at Aizawa to take him in. Does Eri have enough security at the hospital? I'll talk to Nizu and make sure she does. He locked eyes with Izuku. Thank you for telling me. I didn't have much of a choice, Izuku said, and then blasted off again into the air to head to the dorms. In the air, he slowly fell again and took in the view again. Then, on a whim, he began to absorb thermal energy. There was nothing in the way as the area he fell through was devoid of any heat. When he landed in the backyard, the temperature of the area had dropped several degrees. He greeted Toru with a hug and his friends with a smile as he sat with them on the couch. And that's it for part 5 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk. Big thanks to Big Teddy G3498 for helping bring this incredible story to life. You legends are seriously the best, and your support keeps this channel going strong. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more epic content. There's more to come, so stay tuned for part 6. Catch you all in the next one.